the union of GFlowNets and drug discovery.
Thanks, Kolia. So for the record, recursion absorb valence, not the other way around. So valence is parts of recursion. No worries. So yeah, you've heard from Joshua, and I will be repeating some of the stuff, but hopefully with a different perspective. And also, petition is great to learn. So I'll start again with, there you go. I think by now you've heard what a GFlowNet is. I love this slide because sometimes people come to me and they're like, so GFlowNet, that's what kind of architecture is that? I guess we did not choose the name optimally. It's not a neural net architecture, but you've heard that already. So GFlowNets generative framework where initially we designed it to sample combinatorial objects. It's still used a lot for that, but we can now do continuous things, and I think you're going to hear about that later today. And what are the typical combinatorial objects? Molecules, that's where we got started with GFlowNets, but also proteins, language, Bayesian networks, all sorts of things. Yeah, I guess I'll tell you more about how we came to that. Again, as Joshua mentioned, during the pandemic, we kind of threw some reinforcement learning at COVID, hoping to find cool things. We did not find a antiviral, but we did find new algorithms, and that was very fun. And the context setting was basically, we were doing search with reinforcement learning. We had some reward function, some way to quantify how good a particular molecule was. But of course, that reward function was extremely noisy. In particular, those familiar with the context, we're using docking, just some kind of low resolution physical simulation of how, let's say, a small molecule and a protein interact and how much energy is between them. That's of course very noisy because it's only an approximation of physics. And that meant that you can kind of easily fool that reward function, and lots of candidates looked good. But even though lots of candidates look good, it's still a kind of needle in a haystack problem. You just have lots of needle, and your haystack is 10 to the big number. And finding really different kinds of molecules that all maybe were interesting according to that reward was pretty hard. So hopefully you find that set of solutions and you send them to your wet lab and you get more data to kind of bootstrap from. But the big question is, what do you want to send? And the traditional way that people have done this in all sorts of contexts is apply some ML, generate a batch of candidates, and then kind of manually or heuristically pick the best, including some notions of diversity. And that could be like for molecules based on scaffolds, but for all sorts of things, you may want to cover your state space intelligently. But this is all handcrafting. We would like not to have to do that. So the motivation is what's a good technique that finds something diverse by construction. And why is diversity important? I think Joshua has given some pretty convincing arguments. I have more. In organic chemistry, biology, physics in general, but all sorts of domains. As I mentioned, the proxies, the reward functions that we have are very, very imprecise. They're sometimes models of models of models. And so they can only get you so far, right? You're seeing on the right here this nice animation of docking at a more kind of refined level here. And that's really cute, and it's really helpful for someone to understand what's going on when they're trying to understand a molecule, but it's really an approximation. The real world is more complicated, right? This protein might be living in a cell and being jiggled around by many other processes, right? So again, this nice formal picture that I think you're going to see a lot. We want to cast a really wide net. If only one of these modes is actually correct, we'd really like to have one candidate in each of these modes, not just four, let's say, in the same mode, if we're only allowed 4 picks. In reality, of course, the state space, the reward space is way more complex. You don't have these nice, easily separable modes, probably have much worse. So diversity is important there, kind of by construction. Another reason I think it's important that I'm actually working on with other people is we know that neural networks can generalize pretty well, but that heavily depends on what data they're trained on. And as we've mentioned, the more kind of modes you see, the more combinations of different features you see, you would think that a model would want to go to this different mode, right? That's kind of a nice property of generalization and a nice property of getting an energy-based model to go everywhere. And the neat feature of GFlowNets is that they have this kind of by construction, right? As they learn about their reward and their state space, they induce their own training distribution, because typically we train them on policy or on policy adjacent with some exploration stuff. And so as GFlowNets learn, they kind of build their own really nice training distribution, which I believe kind of takes fully advantage of the generalization capabilities of neural networks. So that's another argument for diversity. You've heard about RL and MCMC yesterday. Can totally use them to solve these kinds of problems. So for example, for drug discovery, for molecular design, again, we have an MDP, right? We have actions and rewards, but exploration in RL is a very complex topic, and it's really hard. And in practice, when we apply RL methods, we do tend to see problems with diversity, as has been mentioned. And same with MCMC, mode mixing, a hard problem, right? In kind of expectation in the limit, MCMC gives you the right solution, but you don't want to have to wait forever. And we can also use the usual generative models. The kind of downside of this class of models, usually, although there are, of course, extensions, but the main ones that you've heard a lot about, like diffusion models, are typically based really on having a kind of data set of positive samples, right? So I show you 1 million images of cats and get really good at generating cats. But for something like molecules, because we have this scalar reward instead of this, yes, this is a cat or yes, this is a dog, there's more information in that scalar or in those scalars if you're doing multi-objective optimization. And we don't want to waste that information. It's really useful information. So I'm going to do some reward proportional model. And of course, we want to avoid doing MCMC. So you've seen this before, I think, yesterday. You see it again during your practical sessions. Kind of intro combinatorial objects is, of course, something like smiley faces, where you pick, am I going to choose the eyebrow like this or the smile like this? And the really important thing to notice is that there are many ways to build one given face, right? So for this evil smiling face, there's a number of trajectories that lead to it, and it's very important to account for that. Again, we are in a setting where we assume that we have some kind of reward or energy function. And what we're going to do is use that reward to associate a flow with each state. In particular, for the terminal states, we're going to think of them as sinks. They can absorb all this flow. And the initial state here on the left, you can think of it as the unique source in your network, right? And so we end up with this flow network. The very important part to kind of get the right properties that we want, that you want all your flow to be conserved everywhere. So for example, here, right, you get 3 units of flow kind of flowing into that state. And here, for example, this intermediate state only has 1 unit. And you'll see that if I pause at the right moment, you'll see that it's kind of split in 2 because that state has 2 parents. And then we combine again here, and then we combine again here. So you can do that for all your states. And you end up with a flow network that you can use to sample fixes. So how do we do that? We define this policy that we'll write PF, which if you're in some state S, to decide which state to pick next, stochastically, you assign a probability to each transition that is proportional to the edge flow, right? So here for a particular edge, we take the flow on that edge and divide by all the other flows outgoing from that node. And the really neat thing is, as you mentioned, this gives us a nice generative model. Oops. The ratio here that we're choosing induces a really nice distribution where if all the flows are preserved, of course, the probability of sampling some particular state is going to be proportional to the flow that's going into it. And then that's, of course, extremely useful. Maybe I'll stop there again to see if there are questions. No questions, so I'm assuming everyone here understands. Great. Yeah, so, done this for smiley faces. We can do that for molecules. Here's a really cartoon environment, but in reality, we'd have a lot more things. And so if we have a lot more things, we can't actually, instantiate this flow network in memory. It wouldn't fit. So we have to use function approximation, and we're going to do just that. Typically, we use neural networks, but you can use anything. For example, for molecules, we can use graph neural networks. And what we're going to do, or rather the first thing that we did in the first GFlowNet paper was to estimate edge flows, right? So you have some edge, and typically the parameterization we would use is kind of give a description of that state as an input to the function. And that function would output a number of scalars, 1 per potential next state. You might see in the GFlowNet papers, they're often referred to as actions. That is, again, some kind of historical accident, I want to say, because we kind of inherited all the RL terminology while thinking about these things. It's pretty common in reinforcement learning to think of, I'm at a state, I can take some actions. Here the actions are like, go to next state. But you can think of them here, for example, as one action being, add this new fragment to this existing molecule. And so, seen it already, but hopefully seeing it again will help. One way to encode this desire to train this function approximator is to think of the constraints that we want, right? So given a state, we want all the flow that's coming into it to be equal to all the flow that's coming out of it. And then for terminal states in particular, we are assuming that they're sync states, and so we want all the flow that goes into them to be equal to the reward. Again, we're assuming here the reward is given. The nice thing is that, once again, if those conditions are satisfied and we're sampling trajectories from this policy that we've defined, then it's guaranteed that we sample from the right distribution. So, of course, the first reflex is to turn these equations into a mean squared error. And this is kind of exactly what T0 is doing. Actually, for a large enough state space, that would be a terrible idea. So I'm going to go back a bit here. You'll notice that at the root, right, the initial state actually contains a lot of flow. In fact, you might have noticed in the slides, I don't know if it's been very explicitly mentioned, but what you actually recover is that the flow of the initial state is actually equal to the partition function, which is the sum of all rewards in your network. And the bigger your network is, the bigger your state space is, the bigger this quantity is going to be. Right? So if you have 10 to the 60 objects that you can, possible objects that you're constructing, and for a lot of objects, this reward is something non-zero, the value of Z might be extremely large. So if you're taking mean squared errors here, you're gonna have a bad time because your neural network will have much larger losses for the early states because they have a lot more flow, and will kind of maybe be really good in some sense predicting their flow, but really bad at predicting the flow of terminal objects because the losses there will be extremely small. So what we do instead, and I think what you'll notice we do for basically all the GFlowNet objectives, is we operate on a log scale. And the utility of doing that is that now the value of a mean squared error on a log scale will be kind of invariant to the scale of the flow that you're modeling, right? So close to the leaves, close to the terminal states, the difference in log between two predictions that are wrong will kind of have as significant magnitude than the loss on the early states. And that, it turns out, is pretty important to make the whole thing work. So this first objective, we call it flow matching, and I think, yes, there you go. And there's some interesting things about this objective. First of all, if you do it on the log scale, it's not that bad. If you make your neural network output logits, then these two operations are log sum x operations, which can be numerically stable. And in addition, you can also use an epsilon value that you would add to both terms to kind of stabilize learning here. Actually, your epsilon term here can do more than just stabilize things. It can actually, as I was mentioning, give a preference to the model to ignore some of the very low flow objects, right? So earlier I was saying, if you have, let's say, lots of very small flows and you're doing a linear mean squared error, the mean squared error will be tiny. Whereas if you do it on a log scale, it'll be the same everywhere. If you'd add an epsilon after bringing these terms into a linear scale, if the flows are really small, the rewards are really small in the case of outflows, then the epsilon will kind of bring back again its mean squared error to be really small. So in flow matching, that can actually be used to help the model ignore lower reward states. Second point is, so for those familiar with temporal difference methods, you might be wondering, why are we, using the same network in the target, and why is it not detached? It might be weird to to think of it from an RL perspective, because we're so used to kind of thinking of maybe fitted Q iteration and stuff like that. But here we're doing something pretty different. First of all, maybe your MDP is deterministic, right? So if you think about a double sampling issue that Q-learning has, you wouldn't have it here because, well, you always have the same sample when taking a transition. And then I think maybe it's not quite correct to think about it in terms of RL and temporal difference, because really we're just satisfying constraints. And these kind of locally must make sense and also globally make sense. On top of that, you're using a neural network which will generalize, right? So it makes sense for kind of both sides of the equation to inform each other in terms of loss. So once you have these things, usually, I think most people will train a GFlowNet online on policy. You'll hear later today, and I think tomorrow, about more ways of training GFlowNets that will do some exploration or some offline training on samples. But the basic training loop is very online RL, right? So you start at the initial state, you start the smiley face example with an empty face, and you take actions to build an object and sample a trajectory using the policy that you've constructed. And then once the agent says, okay, I'm done, stop, receive the reward. And then we collect a bunch of these trajectories and apply the flow matching objective along that trajectory. As I was mentioning, this is like the basic thing to do. There are lots of tricks here, of course, but basically, yeah, one thing I didn't mention, of course, but I think Yosha mentioned, is that these objectives are off-policy objectives, right? As long as you have a cover of all the state space, you don't need to be following your policy to learn the correct values. And that means that if you have a data set of trajectories or data set of samples, that can be used to train your model. There's lots of ways, and you'll hear about this more, but the basic way is, you start with some high reward objects and you kind of bias the mini batch of your model to see more of these objects. Of course, doing that will induce some trade-offs. So if you show lots of high reward objects to your model, it might think, oh, there's, problem solved. I already kind of found all the interesting things, and it might not learn to explore properly. So of course, another kind of off-policy you can do is exploration methods. There's lots of them. And the kind of basic one that we've been doing, but of course we should be doing better, is this epsilon online trick that I think people doing Q-learning and variants are very familiar with, where you basically follow your policy, but with some small epsilon chance, take a random action. This works, but of course we can do better. So, of course, one downside of the flow matching objective that I just talked about is that it's very local. What do we mean by that? It only considers, a single state in some sense and learns around it. So the state won't be very informed by the trajectory that it's in or the reward that was part of the trajectory it was in. This has some advantages, but then at the same time, it makes learning very slow because the temporal credit assignment has to kind of propagate slowly from the reward at the end of the terminal states back to the initial states. Another downside of flow matching is that it's very expensive. The main reason is because of these sums. So as I mentioned earlier, the typical parameterization of a GFlowNet that uses these edge flow predictions is you train a neural network, and this neural network's input is actually the initial, well, not the initial state, but the first state on this edge, right? And let's say that this state has 100 children, so 100 actions. You'll simply output 100 numbers, 100 logits for that particular state. Sorry, yeah. So for the outflow, that's not a problem, right? You have one state and then you just output 100 kind of digits. For the incoming flow, though, it's a bit more complicated, right? So you'll notice here S is the input, is on the left-hand side, but here S is kind of one of the outputs. And to take the sum here, you actually have to enumerate all the parents of that state S. Not only do you have to enumerate them, if there's 100 parents, you have to do 100 forward passes of your model to get the edge flow for that particular edge. And, 100 is not that bad, but in some cases, if you're doing molecular design on the atom level, or you're doing natural language in some funky way, you can end up with an enormous number of parents, and that's just not scalable. And so, yes, that's expensive. As I mentioned, this is related to bootstrapping in reinforcement learning. Bootstrapping has a lot of issues. There can be drift, right? Because you're not just bias that induces drift, because you're kind of trusting the prediction of what happens in the next states that your model is doing, and that can lead to a lot of bias and make your model take a very long time to learn. So today you'll hear about much better variants that are more efficient, but also less biased and more stable. You'll also hear about better parameterizations. So once again, the parameterization here is on the edge flow, but all you need is some way of getting flows. And you can get that indirectly by multiplying things, but no spoilers, you'll hear about that. And finally, of course, as with any method, lots of tricks can help. Some from reinforcement learning, of course, replay buffers in various ways can help. Target networks that are some kind of moving average or kind of old version of your model can help stabilize sampling or just learning. You'll also hear about various forms of intrinsic rewards that may help with learning stability or exploration. You can also grab tricks from MCMC. There's a very recent paper that I'm on where kind of combine GFlowNets and MCMC in a very simple way, where you kind of start a trajectory with GFlowNet, land somewhere, and because GFlowNet is diverse, you kind of get that diversity for free. But then you can use MCMC to do some kind of local refinement of your reward. And we know that's going to work because MCMC is very good at exploring locally within a mode. You'll hear a lot about temperature as well. It's very common that if you kind of take some random reward function in some random setting, the scale of it will be a bit wrong, right? So for example, if in your state space you have 1 million objects, and almost all of them have like 0.5 reward and 10 have 1 reward, the total mass of the 0.5 reward objects is still 500,000, right? And so the probability of sampling those will be really high. A simple trick, of course, to kind of lower the probability of those 0.5 reward objects, increase the reward of the 1 reward objects, is to use the temperature. So one thing that we've been doing that you'll see again in papers is just raise the reward to some exponent beta. Usually that beta is some hyperparameter, but it can also be part of the input. So you can learn temperature conditional models, but it's also something that can be scheduled during training. Other trick that you'll hear about, I won't go too much into it, but you can use data sets and maximum likelihood to do interesting things. Yeah, so thank you for listening. And I think I'll take questions, and then Kolia will tell you more about these new objectives that we have.
Nice talk, Emmanuel. You motivated like GFlowNets and then compared it with RL at the beginning, right? And one of the challenges you mentioned was like exploration in RL. it wasn't clear to me how GFlowNets could explore more state space and then gather more data. Like, could you?
Yeah. Maybe let me go back to, well, one of the caveats of RL is that, at least let's say you're doing soft key learning, which is like nice Maxent method, you should get for free some proportionality, but that proportionality is a bit pathological. If there are n paths to this state, then the probability of sampling it yeah, the probability of sampling it will be something like number of paths times the reward, proportional to that. For smiley faces, it's not that bad. You only have like 6 paths to here, but for a molecule that has 50 atoms, you have an unfathomable number of paths, and this bias will lead these methods to do weird things. Another advantage, if you compare to just like even more traditional VDRL, is that some VDRL method might find one mode and be kind of happy with it because, well, it's find a pretty optimal policy. And maybe we can get it to explore, but like it takes a while before the policy learns, oh, I can also go there. In contrast, GFlowNet wants to do that by construction. There's no built-in exploration mechanism, and it wants to spread the probability mass everywhere, and that kind of naturally makes it explore. I don't know if that contrasts them well.
Yeah. Also, like, do you assume like like what molecule fits with what other molecule? Because if you don't know, then you might have to explore all combinations to decide like which ones are fit well, which ones don't, and then it kind of like boils down to the same exploration problem, right?
Well, you have to assume that your reward contains some information and that some of this information can be captured by a neural network. Right? So either the reward itself, right? So a typical scenario is you sent 100 molecules to the lab and you get some reading out of them. And then you train a neural network, random forest, or whatever, on those 100 data points. And that gives you some predictions. And then you can feed in new molecules to that neural network, get new results, and you use that as your reward function. And what you do is bootstrap from that. So you train a generative model, you get maybe 10 new molecules, send them to the wet lab, and then you kind of grow your data set. But you have to trust that there's some information in there, so that this model of reward that you're training captures something. And then that model has to also have structure so that the GFlowNet that you're training to match that reward function can also have some structure. Otherwise, of course, it's kind of hopeless.
Yeah. Also, I was thinking of distributional RL. Like, like what's special about sampling according to rewards? Question A. And 2, can we do this with distributional RL or get much more with that as compared to GFlowNets? Like, any thoughts on that?
Let me start with distributional RL. Distributional RL is about a parameterization of the value function. It's kind of fundamentally the same algorithm. You're learning you're learning the value function of the optimal policy. It's just that in distributional RL, instead of learning the expectation, you learn some distributional form of the value function, of the random variable that the expectation is modeling. But you're still learning the same function. In GFlowNets, you're learning an entire object entirely, different object entirely, which is about this energy-based style model. Can you
could
expand on your second? Sorry.
You could potentially sample actions once you have the distribution or value function or the value of the state. You can potentially sample actions using any of the metrics, right? Not just expected value. Maybe you would want to sample like quartiles based actions or things like that, which kind of gives you like diverse policies essentially, right?
Like not Sure, that's correct, but I'm not a distributional RL expert. One thing I do know is distributional RL will give you something like risk-averse policies, because you can look at the variance, let's say, of the value prediction of different actions and pick the one that's high reward and low variance. But I don't know about using that for diversity, because the best diversity you'd get is diversity of rewards. So you could do the inverse of risk averse. You can do risk seeking, right? You pick the action that has the most variance. But then that just means you might sample low reward actions. Here you can, still sample high reward objects. It's just because of the smoothness, you have this diversity by default. I don't know.
Thanks, Emmanuel.
Hi, I have a very naive question. Okay, so I specialize in physics and I'm not an expert in this field, but in physics, when we look at flows, in nature, we also can have backflows. So I'm wondering, why are all your transfer of information in one specific direction?
Yeah, I guess here we're just using flow as a very convenient analogy.
Yeah.
Not too familiar with what a backflow might be. I think so here we kind of design these flow networks to be acyclic DAGs. And that's very convenient, because then we don't have to think about edge cases.
Mm-hmm.
You could actually have cycles in here.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
It would induce some problems, but we think we can fix those problems without too much difficulty. For
me, it just seems that you would add another dimension, like you would add more exploration. So it might be logic.
Yeah, I'm curious to know what a backflow is, but maybe come see me at the break. Thanks.
Thanks, Emmanuel, for the great talk. So I just wanted to go back to the slide that we were describing how we can train GFlowNet offline. So you mentioned that maybe we can initiate the samples that have high rewards, but what if we don't have access to that, high reward samples?
Yeah, so something that works fairly well is a replay buffer where you only keep your top N samples. Right, and then that kind of counts as leveraging a data set. Is just your data set is dynamic. And that works pretty well. But then there is this trade-off sometimes of if you're too greedy, too high reward with the data that you show your model, then.
Okay. Yeah, but so what if, so I understand that, replay buffer actually keeps the, you can have some sort of a priority in your replay buffer and keep the samples at high rewards. But what if we actually, there's a scenario that we cannot assign rewards to those trajectories. And maybe you can do some sort of clustering and just, figure out what samples have more values to the task that you are trying to solve.
Are you saying if you don't even have a reward function, what can you do?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have some results where if you have a data set, you can do the energy-based thing basically and learn the energy function as you're training your sampler. That's totally fair game. You were talking about clusters. Maybe you could, if you don't have a data set, but you have some notion of distance between samples, you could use that distance information, clustering information to build an energy function or reward function. I think that would also be fair game. As long as it's consistent with the problem you're solving, should be fine.
Okay, thank you.
So yes, I had a similar question related to the one before. What are the reasons of using flow instead of weights, for example? No, it's like to apply the condition that the input has to equal the output of flow, or is there any other reason like for using flow instead of weights?
I mean, the flow is just a metaphor.
Yeah. No.
There's not the physical interpretation here. It's really just a convenient way to think
more
about the
visual,
problem.
Maybe, or to explain the concept. No. Yeah, I was curious about it, because usually we see weights in the neural networks.
Right. Well, so.
You are defining the ratio flow that could be also the same concept, no?
So like, this is this is a flow network, but not a neural network, right?
Yeah.
We never actually see this graph anywhere. Like we don't instantiate it in the program. It's only implicit in the fact that we have an agent that can like build faces, right?
Okay.
So what the neural network sees, let's say, is like a face, and it makes predictions about that face. In particular here, for the empty face, it makes 6 predictions, which kind of tell it which action to pick, which next face to go to.
Yeah, more rewarding, no? Okay. Okay. I think it.
A quick question regarding the training. You said this was done online. I wonder how this, does this mean that for each, for example, given molecule, you're going to have like one online learning pass? Or is there a way to like leverage the fact that different molecule problems might have similarities, like aside from the reward function?
Not sure I get your question. So
basically, are we just like, when you learn online like this, is it like one sort of online learning task for each different molecule you're trying to learn?
Yeah. So one thing we assume is that the reward function is somewhat cheap to compute.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not cheap, like you have to send something to a wet lab, then you can train a proxy for it. Mm-hmm. There are ways around that, but they all kind of, in my opinion, equivalent to training a proxy for it. And then, yeah, so you're just seeing a molecule, training on it, and then you kind of throw away that data because you want to learn about different molecules.
Okay, so basically, like it's more the compute time than the data. You really want to go like one example at a time or like one problem at a time, but you're going to just like, I don't know, use as many compute cycles as possible, and hopefully you're going to like converge towards like right distribution.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Thank you for the talk, Emmanuel. So I had a question concerning the structure of the GFlowNet. Like, I was wondering, what is the advantage of having many trajectories that lead to the same terminal states instead of having a tree for your GFlowNet? Because like one helps to share information, but it also makes the problem more complex because you have to learn more things.
Yeah, I think that's actually an interesting research question. So there's 2 things. One is for something like a molecule or a smiley face, we could canonicalize the order in which you build it, right? So we could always choose the left eyebrow first, then choose the right eyebrow first, then the left eyebrow, then the mouth. Then we would have a tree. Sometimes that's actually really hard to do. For very symmetric objects, like molecules, for example, that you define atom by atom, there's not a good way to canonically build them such that you'll end up with an MDP that's always a tree. Let's say you're building this little triangle here. Well, actually, I don't know if that's a good example, but I think, sorry, I'm trying to think of an example on the spot, but like, if you're building this ring, here, like a neat canonical form would be you always have to start with the oxygen and then the other carbon atoms. But like for more complex molecules, that's not always possible. And you end up with different versions of the same thing, depending on which of these carbon atoms you start with. And in the general case, you can't enforce, well, easily. Maybe you can, but it's a very complicated heuristic and complex masking. But as far as I know, and people in chemistry have been thinking about this a lot for something like smiles, it's really hard to build kind of a unique sequence that describes one object. But another related question, I think, for GFlowNets in particular is that something that will be discussed a bit later is there's implicitly here some kind of backward allocations of the flow. Here, I kind of did something where everything is equal, but you could possibly train a network to say, no, I only want to care about one parent at a time. And then you'd kind of end up with pseudo tree. But I don't know if anyone's investigated that properly.
Yeah, I have a good question about the concept of the flow because I come from the RL background. So for me, this kind of looks like just a value function, but your discount factor set to 1. I was wondering if you ever experienced with, well, if it's possible to have a discount factor where your inflow is equal to like gamma of your outflow, like have this concept of discounted flows, if it breaks your training or not, and would you even be interested in going that path? Like, is discounting even relevant in terms of generating data?
I want to say no, but I think some people have thought about this more deeply than I. So I'll redirect you to them. So come see me after.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm curious if empirically you have any observations regarding the number of samples needed for training relative to the number of terminal states in the problem. Is there any like relation there, or is it
the number of samples to like converge?
Yeah.
It's really problem dependent. I guess these are not cheap methods. Like training on a simplified fragment environment molecule, it can take, 6 hours to start getting decent results. And like I've trained model for days and they still have not converged. They're still learning and discovering new things. But I think it's really going to be problem dependent. Thanks. Probably last question, make it quick, maybe.
I was wondering, there's this assumption in making the composing the smiley face, for example. There's no difference in first doing the left eyebrow, then the right eyebrow. So what if there was a slight difference instead of there could be no difference
right.
assumption, and there could be a large difference, in which case we wouldn't have a DAC. What if there was a slight difference?
Yeah, I mean, this is the case in like fragments. Depending on, let's say you're doing chemical synthesis kind of environments, depending on the order in which you do things, you'll get different results. That's true, and there's ways to handle that. You just have to represent your state in the right way so that when you give it as an input to the network, it knows that the differences are there. But yeah.
Very quickly, what is the trade-off in terms of how you split up your action space? So you could, for instance, have maybe like just a very like a large number of possible paths, but with like only a few actions, so few parents. Or you have a very complex action, so you have lots of parents, but you have kind of less states in your intermediate states. What is the kind of trade-off in training complexity?
That's a very good question. And I think this deserves more study because there are some cases where we've done that experiment. So let's say you're generating a sequence and you only have like 4 tokens. You could have 4 actions or you can generate 1 token or 2 actions or 16 actions generate 2 tokens. So you can think of all the lengths. And if you do that, there doesn't seem to be that much difference, which is surprising. But in some other environments where we're generating graphs, the way you give choices to the agent does seem to matter, sometimes very negatively if you're not careful. And I think that's something that should be studied more in reinforcement learning, how to design an MDP.
Thank you.